Welcome to the Dare to Know podcast. I'm your host, Fabian Corver. Today, we are joined by Norbert Corver. Norbert Corver is Professor of Dutch Linguistics in the Department of Languages, Literature and Communication at Utrecht University and a member of the Utrecht Institute of Linguistics, OTS. For those who might be wondering, he's also my dad and has been a great supporter of the Dare to Know podcast. He's one of the editors of the book series Studies in Generative Grammar, published by Mouton de Gruyter. He's also co-author of 4 volumes of the Syntax of Dutch series, which synthesizes the currently available knowledge of the syntactic structure of Dutch. Lastly, he's the co-editor of various books on generative syntax, including the following: Semi-lexical categories, the function of content words and the content of function words, WH movement, moving on, the copy theory of movement, and Diagnosing syntax. I hope you enjoyed this episode. The Dare to Know podcast is now also available on iTunes and Spotify. Please check out the links in the description below. Norbert, welcome to the Dare to Know podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on your podcast.
Yes, great to have you on. So let's get started. So first off, could you tell us a bit more, my audience, about your background, how you got interested in linguistics, and more specifically, how has your own work been influenced by Noam Chomsky?
Okay, well, I became interested in generative linguistics when I was a high school student. I shared my room with my brother, and he wanted to become a language teacher. And on his bookshelves, there were some books with excerpts from Chomsky's work. And actually, I think there was even a Dutch translation of Language and Mind. And so I started reading a little bit in it and I got intrigued. And I must say, I was always interested very much in languages. So then after high school, I decided to study linguistics and literary studies at Tilburg University. And interestingly, there was a great group of generative syntacticians, including Henk van Riemsdijk and Jan Koster, and they both played a prominent role in generative linguistics in Europe, both at the organizational level and sort of at the level of research. Organizationally, let me mention this because for me that was very interesting because of the dynamics of generative linguistics. Henk van Riemsdijk and Jan Koster were 2 of the founders of GLOW, which is Society of Linguistics, the Generative Linguistic Society in the old world. And so that this was a way of organizing sort of generative linguistics in Europe. So there were annual conferences, which were highly stimulating. They are still there. And one other thing they did is they had this series, Studies in Generative Grammar, which still exists as a book series. So I'm just trying to say that there was a lot of sort of, dynamics. And so then after finishing my studies as an undergrad student, I continued at Tilburg University. I did my PhD under Henk van Riemsdijk's supervision. And again, this was a great time with lots of generative syntax, also because there were many visitors, which created a lively environment. So people were visiting people, who had a background either as sort of a PhD student or as a faculty member at MIT. Right, where Chomsky was at the time. So people, let me mention just a few names because I think they're prominent linguists. People like Joe Ammons, people like Ken Hale was a faculty member at MIT and did a lot of interesting work on Walbury, one of the original languages spoken in Australia. And also Jean-Roger Vergniaud and Maria Luisa Zubizarreta, prominent sort of syntacticians, visited sort of, Tilburg University. So it meant we had a very lively environment. And then, there were also people like Craig Thiers and Rini Huybrechts, colleagues I had sort of at Tilburg University. So for a young generative syntactician, which I was at the time, I'm no longer, this was a great environment. So I learned a lot. And then as part of my PhD, I think it was in my 4th year, went to MIT and sort of, there sort of I could sort of meet Chomsky personally. And so I had meetings with him. I attended his classes. So this was for me a way to get into sort of, generative linguistics.
Oh, that's really interesting. And I know over the past 14 episodes so far, we covered a lot of ground, I guess, with sort of the Chomskyan program and all the disciplines he has influenced. But, today we're going to focus on a few papers that you wrote over the past decade or so, focusing sort of on the connection or interface between language and emotion, which we haven't really covered so far. But before sort of diving into the interface between language and emotion, let's start sort of with sort of the Chomskyan approach when we talk about the interface approach towards the study of the language faculty. So how are we supposed to understand sort of this interface approach? You could tell us a bit more about that, and then also how that helps us understand sort of the broader architecture of the mind and brain. That would be a great beginning.
Okay. Sure. Well, interfaces have always been part of, let's say, generative grammar, in my opinion, right? But since Chomsky's minimalist program, sort of, the focus on interfaces have become more prominent in the study of human language. Now, what is the crucial thing? And I try to explain it. Let me try to explain it by simply giving an example, because then sometimes it becomes clear, what the interface approach is like, right? Now, suppose you have a linguistic expression like John saw a car, right? John saw a car. And now clearly, this linguistic expression, which is an organized structure, has two dimensions which are prominent. It has an interpretation, it has a meaning, and it has a sound part. I mean, when I pronounce a sentence, John saw a car, clearly you hear what I'm saying. So there are these two dimensions which Aristotle actually already hinted at, right? Language is sound with meaning. So these are two sort of, crucial ingredients, let's say, of human language. Now, what does the interface approach say? I mean, it essentially says when you have a linguistic expression, which has a sound representation and a meaning representation, I mean, those linguistic representations, right, because that's what they are, should be interpretable, let's say, to language external, but mind internal sort of, modules that use the information that language gives. So in a way, meaningful properties of, let's say, human language should be understandable by language external systems that make use of those meaning properties. The same on the sound side. When I pronounce, like, say, a sentence, right, then the sounds that I produce, the linguistic sounds that I produce, must be interpretable by external systems. Now, Chomsky refers to these external systems for the meaning part, and he calls it the conceptual intentional system, which has to do with the formation of concepts, with planning, with beliefs, etc., right? And on the sound side, right, there's the sensory motor system. That is the system, for example, that makes it possible to actually articulate sounds, right, and realize them in the real world. You externalize them. So in a way, the interface approach says, there are two crucial linguistic dimensions, what we sometimes call the logical form, and that is the linguistic meaning representation. And there is phonological form, which is the linguistic sound representation. And then the idea is that the meaning properties on the LF side and the sound properties on the PF side should be interpretable, and Chomsky also says legible or accessible, right, to the external system. So in a way, the language system, and that I think is a crucial thing, is not an isolated system. No, it interacts with other modules, let's say, of the human mind. So that is sort of the interface approach. And I think it's interesting because, well, ever since Chomsky's minimalist program, its interface perspective on linguistic expressions has become very prominent. Let's say in earlier stages, there was much more focus sort of, okay, the computational system, how can you generate a linguistic expression, a syntactic structure? So it was more object internal, the way we looked at it. But now, sort of since the minimalist program, people have more and more looked at linguistic expressions from this external perspective. You try to understand the properties of a linguistic expressions from the interface perspective. So the properties of a linguistic expression should be interpretable, legible by the external systems. Does that make sense? Or is
yes,
it?
That makes a lot of sense. And I guess that also opens up the question how, for example, the language system interacts with the emotion system. Before going there, again, just to sort of mention a point often made by Chomsky, namely that language is primarily a tool for the expression of thought instead of, what other people might emphasize for communication. But while you acknowledge then, right, that language is primarily a tool for the expression of thought, so there you are in agreement with Chomsky, you do think nonetheless there are potential interesting questions that can be raised, the interaction between the language faculty and the emotion system. And then you raise the question, and I quote here, if the linguistic expression of emotion is secondary with respect to the expression of thought, how does this secondariness manifest itself in the build of human language? So just how has this question sort of traditionally been approached, if it has been approached at all? And then also maybe as a side note, has Chomsky sort of himself addressed this question related to the interaction between the language faculty and the emotion system as such?
Yeah, that's an interesting bunch of questions. So let me start with this last part, because of course, when I got interested in, let's say, the interaction between the emotion system and the language system, one of the first things, of course, I wanted to find out, has Chomsky something about it in his writings, right? Now, I think, but you should ask Chomsky himself. So I don't think he has given the interaction between the emotion system and the language system much thought. At the same time, I should say, and it's interesting, already in Cartesian linguistics, and the famous book from 1966, I think, he points out that language is a tool for the expression of thought and feelings. Right.
Okay.
I won't give you the page, but I can give it later if you want. But crucially, Chomsky mentions both thought and feelings here. In a later work, actually, I think 2000, The Architecture of Language, there is also a line where he explicitly states, okay, language is a tool for the expression of thought and feelings. So I think he is aware of it. Of course, he's aware of it, and giving some background sort of, which, also indicates that it has been on his mind, is in the context of Cartesian linguistics. Of course, there is a big discussion in the book, and maybe you discussed it when you had your meeting with McGilvray, but there is a part where sort of, the question is, is human language, right, qualitatively different, let's say, from animal communication system? And there he gives some sort of background, let's say, from the 17th and 18th century, right? And there was, of course, a big discussion about what is sort of the origin, let's say, of human language, right? And so some people like Rousseau, of course, argued famously in his article on the origins of language that emotion is the starting point, let's say, of language. And sort of, more scholars at the time argued that, right? So that the clear connection is from, let's say, not from thought, but, from emotion, let's say, to language. But, as Chomsky points out, many sort of, let's say, Cartesians or people influenced by Cartesian philosophy had the opposite view. They say, no, language is, qualitatively different, let's say, from animal communication system, and sort of human language is not simply the expression of emotions, right? And so interestingly there, and I think I should mention his name, and I'm sure you're familiar with him because he was a student of Kant's, is Johann Gottfried Herder, who also wrote this famous paper on the origin of language. I forgot the exact title, but crucially, he points out, there may be a connection between the expression of emotions, right, and human language, but crucially, he says, it can't be simply a story about, let's say, human language, about sort of the realization of one's emotions, right? And he crucially mentions that animal communication, which, people often associate with the expressions of the emotions, right, is really different, let's say, from the expression of thoughts and one's inner feelings. And so there in Cartesian linguistics, which Chomsky wrote, of course, there is indirectly this discussion about the connection between language and emotion. Right. Now, sort of historically, just to give you an idea of where my thinking and interest came from, there is also a phase, and then I talk about the early 20th century, where the study of sort of the style of language, so-called stylistics, came into being, right? And a very important name, I think, here is, first of all, the name of, I think he's a Swiss linguist, Charles Bailly. He was a student of de Saussure, the famous linguist. And Charles Bailly studied the individual style of, persons when they speak, right? And he had the expressive or the emotional dimension of sort of human language. And he tried to find out, okay, so what makes a particular language, right, have sort of this expressive or emotive flavor? And the other person that I should mention here, because I really think he's a very prominent scholar, he used to be, and his readings are still very interesting, is Roman Jakobson, who sort of, was interested both in linguistics and in literary studies and in poetry, for example. One of his famous writings, it's called something like The Closing Statement, in a book by Seebuck, edited by Seebuck, on stylistics, something with Taal-en English or something. Sort of, he also points out that the expression of emotion is a linguistic dimension of human language, right? And he also admits it may be secondary, but it is something in the description and explanation of language that we should take care of and that we should consider. So that is sort of the historical background. So I think, yes, it is mentioned in Chomsky. So he is aware. He himself did not do, I think, any sort of deep analytical sort of studies on the expression of emotion in human language, but other people did in the history of sort of linguistics.
And then sort of before diving deeper into how you actually go about sort of examining this sort of how emotion is embedded in the structure of language, maybe first we should sort of get clear on the definitions of language and emotion, which is not an easy task. So, in emotion theory, there might be, several definitions of what emotions really are, right? So maybe just to clarify before we dive into how you approach this question, like you talk about the task of decomposing emotions, right? And I think that's probably an important hint at what we should be looking at. So how do we decompose emotions?
Yes. So before answering or trying to answer this question, let me sort of point out why it is relevant, why I sort of started thinking about it is because in a well-known book, Language, by Edward Sapir, which was a famous linguist, an American linguist. So somewhere in his book, he states, I don't know the exact quote, but that emotion is meagerly expressed in the build of human language. So he says, well, clearly language is not for the expression of emotions, but crucially, as he formulates it, it's more for the expression of ideas, right? And there you have the connection with the expression of thought. But sort of he emphasizes this point, okay, don't look for emotions, right? It's not property of human language. But crucially, of course, it depends a little bit on sort of your definition of emotions, right? And so when you read the emotion literature, and that's, of course, what I try to do, right? And which was a new world for me. You also notice there are various theories about emotions, right? And sort of one prominent theory is, for example, theory by the emotion researcher Paul Ekman, right? Who had a theory in the 70s or 80s about what he called basic emotions, like such as joy, anger, frustration, whatnot. Yeah. And essentially he said, well, they are sort of, but I'm slightly simplifying, of course, right? Unanalyzable, let's call them entities or constructs. And interestingly, what he pointed out that was main focus was these basic emotions are things that you find across cultures, right? Yeah. And he did interesting studies. And for him, that was crucial to find out whether these emotions have a universal dimension or not. And his claim was, yes, they do. But crucially, so if you take this perspective, like, there is joy as an entity, there is anger, right? There is frustration. And you would raise the question, okay, can we find something that symbolizes frustration in the build of language? Then the answer presumably is no. So for example, that's what I also argue in this paper, point out, right? I don't know of, let's say, a joy suffix that you can attach to a word, right? And suppose you have a word like car and I attach something to it, and that means, okay, I'm happy, right? The way I express this car, has this happiness flavor. Or that there is a movement operation in syntax, right? That you move a verb, from one position to another in order to express anger. Let's say it is imaginable, that the world would have been like that. Now, so when you look for, let's say, symbolizations of joy or frustration or anger in the build of human language, you won't find it. Yep. So from that perspective, you could say, okay, Sapir is right. Emotion is meagerly built. Yep. But when you take a slightly other perspective, and that was what you were referring to, and so other theories of emotions, so-called appraisal theories, try to decompose emotions. So they said, well, these are not unanalyzable constructs. Now we should try to find out how they are organized. And interestingly, and I know you're a philosopher, these people, the appraisal theory, go back to Aristotle in his Nicomachean Ethics, I believe it's called, but sort of who said, okay, well, emotions are in a way sort of evaluative judgments that are about something, right? This intentionality dimension. And so appraisal theories like Magda Arnold, it's the beginning of the 20th century, but also sort of later scholars such as Klaus Scherer, a Swiss emotion researcher, and also the Dutch psychologist Nico Freida, had tried to decompose, right, emotions. And there were two crucial dimensions. First of all, and we may sort of talk about it a bit more later, I don't know. You have the dimension of valence, and that is the assignment of a value right? To a stimulus that triggers an emotion, a positive value or a negative value, which, are on a scale. And there is the dimension of intensity. And, when you read that literature, right, you clearly see, okay, they take a more cognitive approach, let's say, to emotions in trying to decompose the emotions in sort of smaller building blocks and trying to find out what the computational system is that underlies them. Now, the moment you decompose emotions in that way, the question to what extent you can find these building blocks at the interface with language, right? For example, the expression of value, right? Positive or negative, becomes more interesting. And so, for example, that damn car, right? Or that jerk of a policeman, right? You clearly see that damn, right? Is like a negative emotion in a way, right? And you can see, okay, I mean, you can identify building blocks in language, right, that clearly connect to the expression of affect. The same with that jerk of a policeman, right? A jerk clearly gives the speaker's evaluation of the person. I can even say John liked that jerk of a policeman, which means, John, right, at the propositional level has a positive meaning about the policeman. But I, as a speaker, right, because I say jerk, I don't. You see what I mean?
No, I
see
that.
It depends on what kind of emotion theory you adopt.
But there, obviously, you found sort of, part of a theory in emotion that has the primitives that then connect sort of in the generative approach that you have yourself. And so obviously, maybe one thing to keep in mind is then obviously, it won't address all the issues that maybe other emotion theories might ask. But nonetheless, we're focusing on something very concretely that we can now actually make sense of within sort of linguistic context, I suppose. And so now we started with sort of understanding this approach of the sort of interface design, right? And now we understand more what type of emotion theory can do the work and sort of work together with linguistic expressions. But now another piece that you bring in is the fact that linguistic expressions must have a perfect interface design or optimal interface design. So now we should maybe start understanding why that is the case.
Okay, so this idea about the perfect design of linguistic expression finds its origin in Chomsky's work, right? But it is something that you find in the sciences more often, right? I mean, I think even the Cartesian philosophers had something about perfection also sort of in mind, right? So your question is, okay, what is this perfect design? It sort of relates to what I started with in the beginning. And so the idea is you have a perfect design of a linguistic expression. Well, the elements that make up the interior expression are interpretable at the interfaces, let's say with the external modules. So again, the meaningful elements, right, should be interpretable for the conceptual intentional system, and the sound property should be interpretable, let's say, for the sensory motor system, just to make it concrete so that you get an idea of what it looks like. So when I say John saw a car, that's a well-formed linguistic expression. So in a way you could say, okay, both at the phonological level and the semantic level, it is sort of interpretable, right? When I would say John saw a cars, right? Cars, you have an illegitimate expression, right? Because in a way, there are two elements that do not match, right? You have the indefinite article, which typically combines with a singular noun, and you have a plural noun, cars, which, normally in English does not combine with an indefinite article. You say, I saw cars. So that's one example. So you could say, well, when I have the expression, John saw a cars, there is an element which is uninterpretable that doesn't make sense. So you could say, well, maybe the is interpretable, but that means that then the plural element after car, right? Cars does not make sense. Or you can also reverse it and say, okay, cars is interpretable, but, what's the indefinite article doing there, right? It doesn't make sense. And the same with the WH words, for example, when I say, who did you see? A perfect sort of, question in English. But when I say, who did you see, Bill? That's weird, right? You can't interpret it in a way. And the reason is that Bill, in a way, is sort of occupying the position where who should be interpreted. So here you could say, well, who, in a way, is uninterpretable because you can't connect it to the position where it is interpreted, the element that goes with the verb. That will be sometimes called the theme. And the same at the sound level, right? I mean, I find it a bit more difficult, but think of this. There are, with sound, you can combine them, but there are restrictions on the combinations of sounds. So sometimes they call this phonotactic restrictions. So you can combine consonants like S and the T and the R as in strong. But interestingly, you can't, in English, it's weird to say sarong or restong. And so what you clearly immediately see is, oh, apparently there are constraints on sound representations. And maybe there are sound combinations that for the sensory motor systems are illegible, are inaccessible. They can't be pronounced. They can't be articulated.
So that's
this idea of perfect design. You have a perfect design when the linguistic expressions, as regards all its properties, is interpretable, let's say, for the interface systems. And the other dimension, but let's skip it because it's simply the idea is the linguistic expression should be built, generated in such a way that the computational process is sort of the optimal one. So don't use extra operations if you don't need them. Try to build a linguistic expression in as easy a way as possible with fewest computational rules as possible.
That's very helpful. And I think so now we have this idea of like a perfect interface design and why it's important. And I guess it's especially important when we start talking about sort of the affective linguistic expressions, because then you sort of argue that, you know, now we see that there's certain deviations from sort of these perfect representations that we were talking about when you were giving sort of those examples just now. So, you know, what is it about those deviations and how do they sort of show up? So maybe if you could give an example, that would be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so the first thing I did when I got intrigued, of course, by this issue about the interaction between the affect system or the emotion system and the language system was, okay, what kind of phenomena are there that hint at a possible connection? Right? And of course, because, you know, Dutch is my mother tongue, I focused on Dutch phenomena. So what I'll do now is let me just give some examples so that you get an idea, right? But based on Dutch examples, and maybe we can add some English examples if possible. Okay. Now, remember, I gave this example about John saw a cars. Remember? Which is out, illegitimate. In English, you have to say John saw a car. Now, essentially, right, you have the same phenomenon in Dutch. So I give the same example with English words, but it is Dutch. So keep in mind. So in Dutch, we can say John saw a car, an auto, and we can say John saw cars, autos, without sort of an, and perfect. Now, when you look at so-called exclamative clauses, you can say things like Jan zag me een auto's, John saw, and then me, which is an ethical dative, but I won't discuss that, a cars. So you have an indefinite article that normally combines with a singular noun, which precedes a plural noun. So there clearly you have a deviation from a normal pattern. That's one. Another example, again, in the realm of exclamative clauses, is, for example, the use of subordinators and subordinating conjunctions like that, as in English, I think that John is smart, then that is what they call a subordinating conjunction. Now, we have, of course, these things also in Dutch. And crucially, these subordinators are typically used in embedded clauses, clauses that are part of a bigger clause. Now, what is interesting is that, you know, subordinators, this is the equivalent of English that, also occurs in exclamative main clauses in Dutch. So you can say, een boeken dat Jan gelezen heeft, a books that he read, right? Next to a books read John, right? And boeken las Jan. And so what you see is you use an element which, let's say, normally appears in an embedded clause in a structural environment where it normally doesn't appear. So, you know, these, and in English, just to give the English speakers, at least they can think about it. And so in English, normally, let's say in so-called WH constructions, like interrogative sense, like how big is John? You see that the WH phrase, how big, is followed by the finite verb, is, right? But when you have an exclamation, you say, how big John is, right? So here, interestingly, you see that the verb is does not occur right after the WH phrase, you see? And so maybe this is also a phenomenon of, let's say, deviant behavior, deviant grammatical behavior, right? So these are just some examples, and there are many, many more, actually.
Okay, so you sort of explained, right, this phenomena of a deviant behavior, right? But then you also put it sort of in the broader context of Chomsky's notion of a degree of grammaticalness. So, how does it relate to that sort of broader idea?
As Chomsky actually already in his famous book, The Logical Structure of Linguistic Theory, 1955, but also in Aspects of a Theory of Syntax, right, discusses this notion of, grammaticalness, right, or grammaticality. And, of course, as we just discussed, right, I mean, when you look at those expressive or sort of emotive expressions, you can see, okay, there is a deviant property, right? There seems to be a symbol that behaves differently or in an irregular way or whatever you call it, in a marked way. Now, as Chomsky pointed out in those works that I referred to, crucially in the beginning, right? I mean, the generative grammar had to generate grammatical sentences that were possible. But of course, the question is, okay, what is grammaticality? What is grammaticalness, right? And that is something that Chomsky interestingly discusses in these two writings. And just to give you an idea, and there you maybe see the connection with the search for the encoding of emotion in the structure of language. So that Chomsky gives the example, and I read it for you. And misery likes company. Or no, first, John likes company, right? John likes company. Right? Perfect. So you could say, okay, there is the verb like, and typically a like has an agent, the liker, someone who likes, and there is something that is like, the company, right? So John likes company, fine. You could say fully grammatical, no problem. Then, as he points out, you can also say misery likes company. And it's a subtle difference, right? Instead of John, you say misery likes company. And in a way, I mean, you already feel it. So misery is an abstract noun. It's not an agent by itself, right? I mean, at least less so than sort of John. It is to say someone who does the action. And you could say, okay, it's still grammatical, but there is something about it that makes you think, right? You have to reflect on it. And so then, the sentence is fine because, misery is a noun, right? And in principle can occur as a subject of a sentence. In misery likes company, right? Nothing wrong with it syntactically. Now, then he gives the other example, abundant likes company, right? And abundant is an adjective. And so whatever, the food was abundant or whatever. Now, clearly abundant as an adjective cannot occur in the position of a subject, right? So here what he shows is, okay, clearly sort of abundant likes company is, far less grammatical, right? Than sort of misery likes company. And so what he sees is there is gradients. Now, interestingly, as a language user, you try to make sense of it, right? So when I hear sort of misery likes company, I try to assign sort of an interpretation to it. And so maybe you even try it when you hear abundant likes company. And so here Chomsky also refers, for example, to poetry. So when he gives the interesting example, you can say a while ago. I saw him a while ago, where a while is sort of a noun phrase which designates a temporal entity or whatever, right? Some time ago. But then he gives the example from a poem, I forgot whom, but like a grief ago. A grief ago, or, a sadness ago, right? Or whatever, right? So clearly you can see, okay, it is, you can understand it. It's syntactically okay, but a grief is typically not used sort of a noun to indicate sort of temporal relationships. So this is this notion of grammaticalness. And as you can sort of feel, there is a connection with this notion of, let's say, deviant or marked properties in the expression of emotion. You could even think when you use a grief ago, that this has sort of an evocative function, right? That's a reader, should get a particular feeling when he reads it. You see what I mean? And so that's the connection with grammaticalness. It's I can really, because people often have strange ideas about sort of, what Chomsky's notion of grammaticality or grammaticalness is. So I think he's often misinterpreted. So I think I can highly recommend reading, I think it's chapter 5 in Logical Structure of Linguistic Theory for people who are interested. I mean, I had a lot of fun reading it. It's very interesting.
Oh, that's great. And then maybe staying on this idea of deviation. So you also start sort of broadening the scope of, how we can understand a deviation. So, obviously we've been looking at linguistic expressions, but you also actually look at other mental abilities. And in particular, you look at sort of deviation from the expectation in music, right? So maybe, what can we learn there from deviations in music, and what sort of parallels do we see with what we've been talking about, like deviations in linguistic expressions?
When I was working on this property of deviation or marked properties in relation to the expression of emotion, then of course you start thinking about okay, I mean, could this be then also a property, let's say, of other mental abilities, for example, emotion, because, what people always say, okay, people get happy about sort of a certain tune, right? Or they get sad, right? And you can even easily identify, even though you're not an expert, but it's quite easy for someone to say, okay, this really feels sad, right? I mean, this is a sad sound or whatever. Mm-hmm. So I got intrigued by it. And I should also say, let me give this reference. There was a study by the musicologist and also philosopher, by the way, Leonard Meyer. Mm-hmm. And it was sort of in the mid-20th century. And he wrote a very important book on the emotion in music or something. I forgot the exact title, but I can give it later to you if you want. Leonard Meyer. And so for him, the big question is, okay, so how do you express emotions, right? Mm-hmm. In something like music, right? I mean, so for him, so in a way, his starting point was, and there is a connection, I think, with the way Chomsky conceptualizes human language. He says, well, okay, music is organized sound, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, when you listen to music, you can say, okay, there are rhythmic patterns, there are melodic patterns, right? I mean, it's not just a bunch of sounds, etc. No, there is organization to it. And crucially, what he pointed out is, at least, on the basis of analysis of all sorts of, compositions he studied, he said, well, you typically trigger sort of an emotion with music when there is kind of a violation of a regular pattern. Something unexpected happens, right? Of course, this is a very gross generalization and you have to look at it. Crucially, what he said is, okay, you have to create something irregular, something marked. And just to give you an example, well, there is, because that helps, I think, always an example, right? There is, for example, a famous symphony by Joseph Haydn, who was a composer, I think, in the 18th century, and which is also called a surprise symphony. And that is because, in sort of part of the piece of music, something surprising happens, something unexpected. And what is the sort of unexpected property? And let me simply sing the song because this helps. My apologies for the quality of the song. So the orchestra is playing, and it plays pianissimo, very silently. And it goes like this. Bum 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 bum. Very lovely. Bum 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 bum. Right. So the listener is listening to this pattern. It's even repeated. Right, which shows, okay, the listener knows what's to come. And so there is no new sort of information, as it were. So what did Haydn do is he added this very fortissimo sort of, sound at the end, right, with playing the timpani and whatever, right, the entire orchestra. Well, the listeners were really caught by surprise. They didn't expect this. Mm-hmm. And this creates, at least that was Leonard Meyer's theory, a particular feeling. Mm-hmm. And just for you and the audience, there is an interesting book by David Hurren, a musicologist, I think at Michigan State University, who wrote a book called Sweet Anticipation. Mm-hmm. And there's, he elaborates on this theory by Leonard Meyer. And really fantastic work. And so there you can see a certain relationship with the encoding of emotion or affective information in language. Maybe, right? I mean, that's something you have to find out and examine more carefully.
No, certainly, but and just for the audience, we'll put a lot of these references in the description so they can further research them. But I think this is a very interesting sort of a similarity. And I guess one other thing that you bring into the picture is sort of Shannon's theory of information. So far we've been talking about these effectively, as you call, colorful linguistic expressions, but then you also start to claim that they have a high information value. So there you bring in sort of Shannon's theory of information. So how does that idea that we sort of talked about, right, with regard to these effective sort of expressions and these deviations that show up, why does that bring sort of a high information value, and how is that sort of grounded in this theory of information by Shannon?
Claude Shannon, who was a mathematician, right, and sort of developed a theory about a communication where he thought about, okay, so what is information and when does information really sort of bring something new to the listeners, right? Or to the audience. And so he wanted sort of to measure the quantity of information.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is and here you can see the mathematician, he had a very abstract notion of the quantity of information, connected it to sort of the predictability of the information. So his statement was the quantity of information of something, right, is small or not that big, right, if the information is highly predictable, that the receiver can anticipate, okay, this is what is coming. Remember the song by Haydn, right? I mean, sort of when he started repeating the information, the listener could think, I know this, right? And not much new information, right? Something has high quantity of information, right, if then the information is unpredictable, unexpected. So he tries to make this connection, right, and definition, he makes this definition of the quantity of information, which is, of course, very abstract. So getting back to Joseph Haydn's and his final sound, wow, this was unexpected. So for the listener, this had a huge amount of information. Simply because, in what preceded, right? I mean, the listener didn't build up an expectation, or he had the wrong expectation of what the sound would be. So this is sort of, is that enough information?
No, I think that makes obviously like the example of the music a lot more clear.
I should admit, I mean, when you read the paper, which I tried, which is very interesting, it's also one of these papers I think linguists should have read. But, there is a lot of mathematics and very difficult stuff in it, which I'm afraid I couldn't grasp. But the theory is very interesting and actually also sort of taken up by people. For example, I think I referred to it, and maybe we'll come back to it, by very important work by the neuroscientists Gallaston and King, I think. Okay, but that about the notion of Shannon's notion of information, right?
No, but I think that clearly helps us sort of contextualize the example that you gave exactly with the music, right? So I think that's very helpful. But then, right, taking this idea of unexpectedness, right, which, naturally fits also into what you've been sort of showing with your linguistic examples. And then in this context, you introduce another sort of important notion, namely distinguishability, right? And then you say, well, right now also that also makes a lot more sense in the sort of computational perspective, right, that we're adopting. What is this notion of distinguishability? And then, why does that make sense in sort of computational perspective? That also plays a role, obviously, with like linguistic expressions.
This notion of distinguishability, or this use of it, I mean, this finds its origin in this book that I referred to by Gallaston and King, right? So that they make use in a theory about brain computations, right? So they make use of this theory of Shannon's, right? And so they point out, okay, when you have symbols and when you have to compute symbols or sort of sequences of symbols or whatnot, I mean, the symbols should be distinguishable. You should be able to distinguish one from the other. And so, for example, you should be able to distinguish consonants from vowels, right? When you have distinct sounds, you should be able to distinguish a definite. And when you say, I saw the car, right? Then the interesting thing is we are able to distinguish discrete elements like I saw the car in the sound stream, right? And so this distinguishability is a crucial property in computational processes. And so then what sort of Gallaston and King argues is that there are, basically two ways of distinguishing symbols, right? And it can be a property of the symbol itself, right? So the distinguishability at the level of the symbol, right? And there can be sort of distinguishability on the basis of what they call time and space. Let's say simply sort of the position of an element with respect to others. And so where is it? Right? So for example, the car and a car, you can distinguish the definite article and the indefinite article, right? On the basis of their own quality, right? The is different from a, right? But, for example, the noun check, as in, please give me the check, right? And the verb check, I have to check my car or whatever. Right there, you can see, okay, it's the position of the sound sequence check, right, or the word check that distinguishes these two. Now, the connection I tried to make, building on these insights by Gallaston and King, was, okay, so when you encode, let's say, affect or emotions in the symbols of human language, right, this distinguishability matters. Right. And so a way of sort of encoding this distinguishability at the level of symbols is, for example, what I called augmentative suffixes. And so let me just give an example. So in Dutch, you can say ik, I, right? But you can also say ikke, right? You add a schwa to the first person pronoun I. You can say what, the WH word, an interrogative WH word, meaning what. We can also say watte, right? Button,
Yeah.
right? And there you add a schwa. So here clearly you see you manipulate sort of the symbol, right, itself, and it has a distinguishable meaning, right? I mean, it adds something expressive. At the level of space, base, or location, right? Let me return to the example I gave earlier. And when you have an exclamative noun phrase in Dutch, the indefinite article, normally precedes a singular noun, right? A car. An auto. But in those exclamative noun phrases, what you see is that the singular indefinite article, at least what looks like it, precedes a plural noun. So the position of the indefinite article is marked or strange or unexpected compared to what follows, namely a plural noun. You see? So that is what I try to so this notion of distinguishability, I try to make use of, and then I add a third type of distinguishability. And that you sort of say, okay, you can also even, make, let's say, a symbol more prominently available in the linguistic structure, and that is sort of duplication. And that's sort of the repetitions of symbols, right? Because when I looked at expressive or affective phenomena in Dutch, I noticed that there is a lot of, repetition or iteration of information. And so again, let me give, one example just to clarify it and show, okay, there really are these empirical phenomena. So in Dutch, you can say a very big car, right? And then big, for those who don't speak Dutch, has an inflection. And so you say a very big plus an inflection, an adjectival inflection car. But we can also say an erge grote auto, a very, degree word, plus inflection, big, plus inflection car.
I see.
And so in a way, you see this inflectional property spreads in a way to the degree word, right? And we can even say, this is just for you, een hele erge grote auto, where it even spreads to hail entirely, right? And also, interestingly, in curses, we can say, godverdamme, right? Which is blah, right? I don't like it. And you see the quality of the vowel spreads onto the rest of this emotional expression.
I see.
And so when I say damn, I say godverdomme. The right, is a sort of similar, let's say, to the in phonology, they sometimes refer to these things as vowel harmony. And so interesting, the phenomenon of vowel harmony does not exist really in Dutch, but interestingly, in those interjective expressions, you sometimes see sort of vowel harmony-like phenomena, right, where a property spreads throughout the expressive element. So that's intriguing.
Yeah, no, that's very intriguing. And sort of, we've been talking about this linguistic encoding of affect and sort of, formulating it as sort of this secondary flavor that it has. But, some people might jump to the conclusion that this sort of encoding also has sort of an inefficiency to it because they are sort of deviant sort of phenomena. So people might assume, well, they're not going to be very efficient because, they're rare in that sort of aspect. But you're going to sort of introduce this idea of perfect imperfections. So how are we making sense of that?
Yeah, I was really struggling with this, I should admit. But of course, that's the big question. When you have an imperfection, why have it, right? And so a way of thinking about it is, okay, something that appears to be an imperfection maybe is not so imperfect at all, right? So, and of course, I was sort of pushing, let's say, Chomsky's theory, right? Approach. They say, okay, I mean, if expressions, have a perfect design, right? What about those apparent, let's say, superficial irregularities, right? Can we make them perfect in a way? So what I was playing with, and let's not get into technicalities, right? But what I was playing with at the time was, okay, so there are these two sort of interface dimensions. Let's say the interface with, let's say, the sensory motor system, let's say sound, and the interface, let's say, with the conceptual intentional system, let's say meaning in the broad sense. Importantly, I mean, these two properties are part of human language, right? But as you can imagine, a sound property will not be interpreted or cannot even be interpreted. You can have many discussions about it, but let's assume by the sensory motor system, cannot be interpreted by the conceptual intentional system. Because a sound property is a property of sound, and it doesn't directly make sense sort of, to connect the conceptual intentional system. Vice versa, you can say, okay, when you have a meaning property, say indefiniteness, as in a car, then sort of represents the meaning indefiniteness. I mean, sort of when you would send it, let's say, to the external system that is related to sound, to the sensory motor system, it would be uninterpretable, right? Because it doesn't make sense to interpret a meaning property at a sound level and vice versa. You see what I mean? And so in a way, there is this division of labor. right?
Mm-hmm.
So what I was thinking of now is, so when you have, let's say, a legitimate expression like I saw a car, and let's focus again on a car, and you can say, right? I mean, the sound properties are sent off, let's say, to the sound part and gets interpreted. Fine. The meaning part, right? Its meaning properties get sent off, let's say, to the meaning interface. Fine.
Yep.
But what now when we have these exclamative noun phrases like I saw a cars, meaning I saw many cars or whatever, right? It's exclamative. And so a way of thinking was, okay, but suppose now that what is sent off, let's say, or represented at the linguistic level is only at the sound level. That is, in a way, you pick the lexical atom, right? Right? But the only thing that matters is its sound, right?
I see.
In a way, you do not represent the meaning properties. So in a way, what you do, and this sort of connects to certain theories about words or linguistic atoms. Some people say the properties of words are sort of literally what they say distributed, right? They are not sort of all connected to this one element, let's say in the lexicon, but in a way words, have properties that belong to different parts of the grammar. Then the idea would be that in a way you only use, and I'm simplifying, but that was sort of, the intuitive idea, only use the sound part, right, to stick it into a linguistic representation that gets interpreted by PF system.
I see.
And in a way that makes this symbol sort of an expletive element, that is to say, a meaningless element. It is an element that can potentially occur in that position, but in a way, you're using it in a deviant way by only using the sound part.
I see.
And I should mention sort of the idea of expletives is something, existent in the study of language. So for give you an example, the word it in It Seems That John is Stupid, it has no reference, right? And so you can have elements, right, that are there, but, don't clearly have sort of, let's say, a semantic meaning. And maybe it's, many discussions about it, does have sort of a sort of meaning, right? As people assume it is present sort of, in syntax. But you see the relationship. I mean, so maybe those building blocks, like the subordinators, are used in a different way, namely only at the sound level. And maybe this is the strategy to make it interpretable, maybe for the affect system. You see what I mean? And so in a way, it is as if the emotional system really looks at the level of externalization. And here I thought that you could make a connection maybe, and getting back to Sapir, as so many people say, okay, the expression of emotion is typically a property, let's say, at the level, not at the level of meaning or syntax or whatnot, but more at the level of the externalization of sound, right? I mean, and then you could say, maybe you use part of the symbol in sort of as optimal as possible a way. And that I found intriguing, right? Because essentially what you're doing is you're using a symbol that is available in language for the expression of thought. For example, indefiniteness, right? But in a way you use, right, at least part of that symbol, right, to express something else, namely emotional meaning, which maybe, right, is only the sound interface, let's say, with affect. You see what I mean? So that was sort of my struggle. And I'm not sure whether I'm still happy with this idea, right? But it is a way of trying to make sense of it. And what I liked about it is that human language is efficient in that way, right? We use, it is not that we invent new symbols, right? To express sort of affect. No, we use existing symbols like subordinators or indefinite articles, right? In sort of, let's say another way. And that I found intriguing. And so you could also say, okay, in a way, maybe that makes language very optimal. I mean, it's not as, language learners, we sort of create all sorts of new symbols in order to express affect or whatnot. No, we build on what's already there, right? And maybe you use it in a different way.
I see.
At least that's what I tried to develop. But,
I think, that's interesting because, I mean, on the one hand, right, like from the interface approach and then specifically from like the language faculty approach, right, like this sort of state of perfection is sort of important, right? But I think, I mean, I'm not sure if you agree with that, but like when you take it sort of to the information sort of level, right, which seems to be quite more holistic in the sense that it can bring different systems together, right? There, this type of perfection seems to return. Like if you're like very strictly just focusing on like the language faculty sort of as it is itself, right? Like then you might talk about imperfections from sort of the standard state, I suppose, right? But if you take it more holistically, then it seems to be mostly optimal, exactly that it's from an interaction type of perspective.
Because crucially, and that's of course, our future research agenda. Let's say, and so you want to know, like Chomsky pointed out, okay, and others, that the faculty of language interacts with other systems. It's not an isolated thing, right? And then of course, the real research question is, okay, what are those other systems? Right? And then you can imagine, I mean, if language, right, is an interacting system, okay, and if it interacts with different kinds of systems, okay, I mean, is language making economical use of what it has, right? Or does it create symbols for all of these different interactions? Right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so that's actually, I think, what you're sort of imply, right? And so maybe these other uses typically occur at the interface levels. And that could be. Anyway, but it's an intriguing question, also a very hard question because as Chomsky points out, and as also people in emotion research point out, it's so difficult. Let's face it, right? I mean, what is the thought system, right? I mean, you need to make it more specific, and the same for the emotion system in order to be able to find out, okay, but those are the interactions that maybe exist, right? Because I mean, only when you make it more specific, you can start looking, let's say, for those kinds of interactions in a more specific way.
This reminds me of my conversation with like David Poupel, like a previous episode when he was talking about, right, like neuroscience and then sort of linguistics and then trying to find, I mean, sort of what he called like the incommensurability thesis, namely what are the primitives that sort of connect with each other, right? And I guess from this lingual sort of faculty interface type of approach, right, like a similar question arises, right? Like what are the primitives that seem to connect with one another?
Yeah, absolutely. Because interestingly, and then but it's clearly in the emotion theories, also what you see, there are the psychologists studying sort of emotions, but there are also the neuroscientists and someone like Antonio Damasio. And when you read those studies, I mean, often they talk a different language, right? I mean, you can see. So interestingly, in his latest book, Damasio, The Strange Order of Things, a wonderful book, I mean, discusses valence as a property, a crucial property of, let's say, feelings, right? But I think in his other sort of popular science book, like Descartes' Error or whatnot, I mean, I don't think he very explicitly discusses valence, but only sort of once you start having sort of agreements about what the core entities are, right? At the cognitive level or at the neuroscience level, at the brain level, I mean, you can start helping each other and have a good conversation. So Poupel is right. I mean, there is this incommensurability problem, right? What he calls it, I believe, right?
Yeah. No, that's correct. And then maybe focusing on another notion that I think you alluded to a little bit earlier in the conversation, namely the idea of intensity. And here also you sort of connect that, right, to Spinoza's idea of like the strength of an emotion. And you say, obviously, like this is a sort of core ingredient of the expression of emotion. And then again, the question arises, I guess, how this intensity is expressed linguistically, right? So then you discuss sort of two options, I guess. So one is intensity via sound, and then again, intensity via syntax. So how are we supposed to make sense of this idea of intensity in the context of what we've discussed so far? And then how does that sort of show up, right, via sound and syntax?
Spinoza, very important work, right? His stuff on ethics, right? Made this crucial remark about intensity. Interestingly, he also discussed valence, right? And so he points out that in a way, joy and anger are sort of the core emotions, and other types of emotions are derived from that. And so that's interesting. So when you look at psychologists, right, they make this notion of valence, and they talk about positive and sort of, negative valence and everything in between, right? But in a way, it was already present in Spinoza, and I wouldn't be surprised, but it's something for you to check, and that you can also find it in Aristotle's work, because, he thought about this appraisal thing. Now, as Spinoza points out, right, I mean, well, there is also the dimension of intensity, sort of a positive evaluation of something, an event or a person or an object or whatnot, right? But there can also be degrees of being positive or negative about something. right? And actually that is what's behind this notion of intensity. As he sort of states, I think it's the degree of being a passion, right? Because at the time they spoke about emotions as sort of the passions, right? And so intensity is a crucial ingredient, and as also sort of appraisal theorists argue in many of those books, right? Intensity is always sort of a core notion that is discussed. And if intensity is part, let's say, of the emotional system, right, then the question arises, okay, is there again a potential interaction, let's say, with the linguistic system, with human language? Right? Are there ways of encoding intensity in the build, let's say, of human language? Now, of course, I mean, well, not of course, well, when you start looking at it, well, for sure, there are degree expressions in human language, right? Which, indicate this intensity already, right? You can say a very nice car and an extremely tall man, right? Or, and so you can see you have degree words, and so that we can indicate the degree to which a certain property holds is clearly a property of human language. And so, but you could say, well, maybe this is a, let's say, property at the level of non-expressive meaning. That is to say, a regular meaning property. Right? When you look at languages, I think all languages, can express sort of degree, sort of linguistically. For example, by means of degree words such as very or extremely or whatnot, right? But sort of what we are looking for is this more expressive or affect-related dimension of, let's say, intensity. And so when you start looking at that, right, and looking for phenomena that hint at that, and again, so you take the perspective on the various dimensions of human language, such as sound and syntax, morphosyntax, and whatnot, right, then interestingly, you do find phenomena like that. So let me give an example of at the sound level first. And so, and again, sorry for that, I base myself on sort of Dutch examples, but I'm sure, non-Dutch speakers can envision what it is like and sort of compare their own language. So one strategy is, for example, well, there are sort of what we call voiced vowels, for example, or for voiced consonants, right? Like v and vis, right? Or v and vis or whatever. A strategy that you typically find is when sort of someone is using language in an emotional way, certain voiced consonants, right? Like frigatives or whatever, become voiceless. I'll give you an example. So when you qualify a person and you say, you dirty man, right? Or you dirty guy, or, vieze vuile kerel, right? Right? Which is a dirty, dirty guy, right? Or two different. And so you can, when I'm really angry, I can say, vieze vuile kerel, or vieze vuile gore, right? Voiceless, right? Vieze vuile gore vent. Right? So what you see is at the initial consonant of the syllables, right, becomes voiceless, right? Another example is make the cluster of consonants more complex. So there is this interjective expression in Dutch, jonge, which is, oh boy, right, in Dutch. Jonge literally means boy. But, when we use it as an interjection, I mean, we don't recognize it anymore as boy. Right? But we can augment it. We can say jonge, T-ye, right? Instead of yo. We can even say jonge. You say jonge. And so we make a cluster of sounds, right? Now, this is, again, something at the sound level. Of course, also volume. So Jacobson, in his famous study, says, for example, you can say a big car, right? A big car with a short e. But you can also say, oh, that was a big car, right? A big car. And as he points out, he says, well, actually, this is, you manipulate sort of the vowel at the sound level. It's a linguistic property because what you're doing is you're lengthening the vowel. And lengthened vowels is a property of human language, right? He shows this on the basis, I think, of Czech, right? But interestingly, so what he says is, okay, this is a property of human language, right? Of the vowel system lengthening. And sort of in expressive use, this is what you do. Now, a quick example on the basis of some morphosyntax. Well, just quick. I already mentioned this example where an inflection on an adjective gets spread onto a degree word, right? A very inflection, big inflection, car. And so there you have sort of a weird inflection on a degree word, right? Where you would accept it. That's you see in a way, morphologically, a property on the adjective is spreading onto the degree word. But when you look at dialects, and I should say here that it's very interesting to look at dialectal variants of a language, because they're often, right? I mean, you see this expressive use of language also in the reference grammars. But you have this phenomenon of, let's say, indefinite article repetition. So in sort of expressive use of language. So again, with, let's say, expressive constructions like what a big car, right? Or what a big, nice car. What they do is they say, what a big, nice car, right? So they repeat indefinite article. So in a way, and that's what I find interesting, maybe also these phenomena help us identify pieces of structure in language. So maybe pieces of structure that are hidden, let's say, in non-emotional language, surface in emotional language.
I see
what I mean?
Yeah.
Maybe all these repetitive indefinite articles that you repeat actually realize positions that are available in syntax, but that normally do not surface.
I see.
And that makes, the study of affect in human language maybe very interesting.
I see. Yeah. And then maybe one other part of your research that you've done is sort of focusing on cursing, right? And then the syntax of complex cursing. I think you already gave a few examples of cursing, right? But, you also say that cursing, right, sort of as a whole could be seen as sort of a tool for the expression of emotion and affect, right? So maybe you could tell us a bit about sort of, right, like these cursing expressions and how that helped us sort of develop this idea of this encoding again of affect.
Yeah. So of course, when you start working on, let's say, the encoding of affect in human language, maybe one of the first things is, okay, what about cursing, right?
Yeah.
It seems to be, let's say, a core example of sort of the interaction between emotion and language. I got intrigued by it. I don't think it has been studied a lot. Why I got intrigued by it, let me emphasize that was, mostly people think, curse expressions like God damn it, or the famous Dutch curse, godverdomme, which has sort of the same meaning, right, are sort of, unanalyzable chunks, right? It is something that's stored maybe in your lexicon or whatnot, right? And that's it. So they don't have a structure.
Yeah.
And what I did in this study was I tried to find out, do they have a structure, right? And if so, what does it look like? So what I started to do is I started to address the question, right? Is there structure in the build of, let's say, curse expression, again, based on Dutch? Because especially with those curses, right, you have to use your intuitions and to see what is possible and what not. Right? Now, I won't go into it deeply, but what I discovered was that even though there is this curse in Dutch, godverdomme, the equivalent of goddammit, right? It's clear, that it's not simply a stored chunk, which is unanalyzable, right? No, it has, so let's call them curse atoms. There are subparts in it that help you build curses, right? Or curse expressions. And so some evidence for this was, well, you can sort of isolate parts of the curse godverdomme and use it sort of independently. You can say God, God, all right, or goddomme or godver. And so you can see, you can build new curses by taking the ingredients. Secondly, and that's a famous substitution test in syntax classes in the first year, is that you can replace a subpart of the curse by something else. So instead of godverdomme, you can say godverdorie or godvergut, right? Which is godver plus vagina or godver plus dory or whatnot. And so clearly you can, in that sense, build sort of new curses. Thirdly, I noticed that, you can start building curses, let's say, in an unlimited way. And so there are these expressions like godver, de godver, de godver, de godver, right? Where you have this curse atom godver, which is linked to another godver by a linking element de. Right. But you don't only do that because someone could say, well, that's simply a repetition, but you can also do it with different kinds of curse atoms. And so I'll just give you the example, and the audience should simply listen. In that you can say, godver de zakker de nom de ju. And godver de zakker de nom de ju. And I don't know what you think, but I can easily say, but maybe I'm too good of a cursor. Godver de zakker de godver de godver de godver zakker de nom de ju. When I'm really angry. Right. So what it shows to me, and that's why I was intrigued by those curse expression, is, well, here you're really using syntax, right, to create complex curse expressions. And interestingly, the curse atoms themselves, if you look at it, don't have sort of a clear, meaningful content, right? I mean, it's very hard to say, okay, this is the meaning of Godver or this is the meaning of Zakker, right? They do contribute something, but when you ask people, okay, what exactly is the meaning? It's not so clear. So in a way, what you seem to have is a very nice case of, let's call it nearly pure syntax. You're simply combining symbols, and you can do it in sort of an infinite way. And so just like what Chomsky pointed out, so if you can build linguistic expressions, right, and in an infinite way by adding stuff, by adding syntactic structure, right, the recursive properties of human language, like John and Mary and Peter, John and Mary and Peter and Bill, right, or John thinks that Mary hopes that Peter will say that and blah, blah, blah. In a way, you find this possibility of generating an infinite number of curse expressions, and also in this domain, in the domain of affect. And that I found highly intriguing. And that I found sort of an interesting property, because it shows that the expression of emotions here, this recursive property built in. And so that's why I called it, the title of the paper was Recursing in Dutch. And so it's cursing plus the property of recursion.
Right? I see. Yeah. And when we tie that back to the idea of, because cursing, at least to me, it sounds also like coming back to the idea of intensity, where you said, right, like it was both through sound and syntax. Like this would be like a perfect example where both show up. Like, is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a good point. So there is syntax involved in the sense. Yeah, I didn't mention it, but I think they are coordinated structures, right? So I assume they have the syntax of coordinations, and coordinations, as we know. You can keep on sort of adding conjuncts. So it's sort of like infinite structure building, right? So that's sort of syntax. But crucially, there is also, let's say, sound property involved. Yes. So for example, this linking element, right, in this paper, so we can say, Godverzakker you. So Godverzakker you. But we can also have as a variant these sort of, linking elements, right? Godverzakker you. And this, speculate a little bit on it, but these possibly are simply phonological additions. In a way, I treat them as conjuncts, right? Or conjunctions, I should say conjunctions, coordinators that connect the two curse atoms, right? So that you can build a complex curse atom.
Yes.
But in a way, it simply spells out the coordinator, the linking position. Right?
I see. Yeah. And then another fascinating sort of thing you highlight with regards to cursing, I guess, and something that we've discussed over many episodes is sort of the creative aspect of language that shows up through cursing. And I think this is interesting because, we've been talking about the creative aspect of language use, right? Where, we're sort of emphasizing the innovative and free from control by external stimuli. But this might be a very concrete case, right? Like cursing that really makes the case there. So could you maybe say a word about that?
Yeah. So when you look at cursing, I mean, if something gets close, let's say to animal cries or whatever, right? You could say, well, maybe it's, like those curse expressions, right? Because it's an utterance of some sort of emotion, right? You externalize an inner state, right? Which is emotional. So, and as you know, so people have pointed out that in animal communication, right? I mean, animal cries or whatever, or calls, whatever you call them, are often stimulus bound. There is a particular context, like there is a tiger, and then there is this fixed sort of alarm call, all right, or a call of aggression, right, that you can hear, right? But there is clearly sort of this contextual requirement, this stimulus that triggers a specific sort of Now, when you look at cursing, in a way, I mean, I can use a variety of curses for one and the same, let's say, emotive experience. When I hit my thumb, with a hammer on my thumb with a hammer, I can say God for you, or I can say God verkut, right? Or I can say zakker de you or whatever, right? So there is no clear connection between the trigger and the linguistic utterance, because interestingly, by the way, so the curse expression Godverdomme can even be connected to both positive, right, circumstances, a positive trigger, and negative. When I'm drinking a beer in a bar and I really like the beer, a good IPA, I can say, Godverdomme, what a lekker pilsje. So, God damn it, this is really nice, the beer. But I can also use it to express sort of, negative emotions. I have godverdomme, what a vervelende kerel. God damn it, what a nasty bloke, right? And so clearly this shows, okay, I mean, the linguistic expression, the curse expression is now directly connected to a specific trigger. So that is interesting. The other thing is the unboundedness in scope. And that sort of relates what I already hinted at is, well, you can curse creatively. Right, I can, on the basis of, let's call them the curse atoms, right, which I treat as root elements, roots in this paper. They can be combined in a creative way, right? I mean, there are all sorts of curse expression. I mean, the number of curse atoms that you connect to each other can be, endless, right? And so this directly connects to Chomsky's notion of the creativity of language use. Again, the grammar makes available, right, all the things that you need, namely the atoms and the computational system, the generative procedure to generate all these different curse expressions in Dutch.
And taking what we've been discussing, right, and put it sort of in a broader perspective of like cognitive science, right? Like how is it sort of linking to the broader narrative, I guess, of cognitive science? So, the interface between language and emotion, but now taking it from a broader cognitive science perspective. And you really interesting set out sort of like, quite a few similarities that we should be aware of, at least when we approach these questions towards both of these systems. So maybe you could help us with a few characterizations between these similarities and then also how that shapes the project of cognitive science.
Yeah. So again, I should emphasize that's what I learned from this little project of mine. And so when I started looking at emotion as a property of us human beings, right, or sort of as a capacity we have, or it's interesting because you immediately also have sort of a comparative perspective on the object that you've been studying so far, in my case, faculty of language. And also what I find interesting is, okay, let's say in theories of linguistics, right, people have different opinions about what language is. And so, for example, to mention one thing, people often raise their eyebrows when you say, okay, there is an innate part of, let's say, human language, right? Chomsky's claim, the innateness and et cetera. So, and then it can be helpful when you sort of start looking at other mental capacities. Okay, let me just give, because again, in the paper, or in this manuscript, I don't go very deeply into it, but I simply mention a couple of things that I found interesting, at least. Okay, one thing we could characterize as the decomposition of linguistic constructs and let's call them emotional constructs, right? So, and I already hinted at earlier, what I found interesting is in linguistics, we are very much used to decomposing linguistic expressions in smaller units, right? Let's say syntactic units, word, units, morphemes, phonemes, etc. And what I noticed in, much of the, let's say, emotion literature, this is not done. So I was very happy when I found these appraisal theories where at least to a certain extent, people try to decompose those sort of, emotions. And then, of course, it's interesting to raise the question, okay, to what extent are the nature of sort of the representations, the emotional representations, or kinds of objects similar or different than the linguistic representations. Something that struck me, but again, that's simply terminology, but in one of those emotion books, a book on the cognitive theory of emotions, it's called by Clore and Ortoni and another person, they literally talk about generating emotions. So I'm sure, they don't mention Chomsky, but I'm sure, they were influenced. And they really talk about the decomposition, let's say, of emotions. And they even talk, interestingly, they spoke in that paper about the deep structure and the surface structure of emotion. So clearly there are connections. And then it's always interesting, okay. And so for me, and that's not a research agenda for a linguistic theory, but maybe more for emotion researchers, it might be interesting, right, to look at emotions even more, let's say, from a decompositional perspective, right? I mean, as Richard Feynman famously said, there is structure, at the bottom, let's say, of, I don't know the exact word, but there is always more structure,
I think always more room at the bottom.
There's always more, exactly, great, thanks. There is always more room at the bottom, right? I mean, and that, we know this from study of language, and, maybe this also holds for the study of emotions, especially so because, many emotion research say, okay, that the types of emotions that you have in a way is endless because and this seems to suggest, if you have ingredients, right, maybe, you can combine them in different ways, which generate, these different in the same way that we have, let's say, different types of linguistic expressions. Who knows, right? And I can't make it more precise, but it's interesting, to take this perspective. Another thing is that struck me was about innateness. When you read the literature, many emotion researchers immediately will claim, yeah, sure, there is an innate component. I mean, it must be, right? And what you see in the study of language, people often have doubts, right? I mean, people don't like it. Also, I mean, in those people claiming that emotions have an innate component, they also say, okay, of course, there is also a cultural component, right? It matters, whether I grow up sort of in the Netherlands or in Japan. The way you express, your inner feelings, may vary. But crucially, core properties, let's say, of the emotions, as also Ekman pointed out, are highly similar. Right. So, and this connects, let's say, the approach, the principle and parameters approach, where we say, okay, there's like a blueprint of what language can look like. Right. But, individual language can differ from each other and sort of at the point of, let's say, the parameters, right? Those defined points of variation in the structure of language. So maybe, something similar. Again, I don't know, but it might be interesting as an emotion researcher to get inspired by what we see in the study of language. Right. Well, so these were 2 points. Maybe I had more, I don't remember, but I think this also means sort of at the larger scale of the architecture, let's say our mental capacities, in a way you're comparing mental capacities. And what we know, we learn a lot from, let's say, comparing languages with each other, right? So it might also be very interesting, and we will learn a lot from sort of the comparison of, let's say, mental systems, right? Such as the language system or the system of feelings or whatnot. But again, coming back to what I earlier said, I mean, you also need to have a clear idea of what those systems are. And because otherwise you have a very difficult task, right? If you don't know what the connections could be, right? But again, I found it inspiring because, for example, again, this innateness thing, I think, okay, people are always sort of making a problem here, right? But then it's intriguing to see that, okay, in the realm of sort of emotion, people are not surprised by claims like this. I mean, this is what emotion researchers typically argue for.
I suppose that's also like maybe some evolutionary work, right, on emotion and language that has some convergence that might be sort of required to support that narrative.
Well, interestingly, that's interesting that you mentioned Darwin, of course, and this connects sort of, to the interview I had with Bob Berwick. Of course, Darwin, and besides this other famous book, wrote a book on the expression of emotions, right, where he discusses the ways animals express their emotion. And interestingly, at a very global level, you can see sort of similarities, right? For example, a cat, when it's angry, or a dog makes it himself or herself big. Right. So, which at a very superficial level, you could say, okay, that reminds me of augmentative sort of, elements, right? You make a pronoun bigger, right?
I see.
But, let's be careful with that, right? Because at such a different level. But it's true. I mean, sort of, you could even at that level try to make comparisons. Interestingly, and then I finish about this point. Damasio, in his works, emphasizes that human emotions are qualitatively different from animal emotions. So, for example, what he says is we can connect, and that's this valence, we can assign value, positive or negative, to so many things. Right? This can be a poem, or even the way you write a letter, right? Or the way someone runs, take the Olympic Games, right? So our sort of evaluation is so sort of widespread. And also when you look at the types of emotions like frustration, or it's not just joy and anger, but there's so many, I like astonishment, or frustration, or there are all these subtle emotions where, we have words for, and sometimes we don't have the words for, but we know that it is there. You can raise the question whether you find those, let's say, call them secondary emotions and primary emotions, such like joy and anger, whether you find them in animals. I mean, can an animal be frustrated? I don't know. So before we say, okay, animals have emotions, right? So they are not that different, let's say, from human beings. You really have to look into the phenomenon very carefully, right? It's the same with communication, as Bob pointed out in the interview I had with him. I mean, sort of animal communications are really qualitatively different, right? The human language, right? And also, as Chomsky, Fitch, and Hauser pointed out in their famous science paper, right?
No, I think that's interesting. That also, I mean, like sort of our ability to attach valence, right, to like huge sort of range of scenarios, right, that might not be mirrored in animals. That also reminds me maybe of another faculty, like the faculty of reason, where some people might emphasize that our value giving capacity to whatever we would like to value is sort of unbounded. I mean, that just might throw another faculty in the mix.
Yeah, but that's interesting that you mentioned, because actually, I must admit, I was sort of struggling with it. I said, also, if feelings are like appraisals, right?
Yeah.
So the question is, to what extent is it different from thought, which again connects to reason, right? So you could say, I think in a way, that's what these appraisal theories are hinting at. And they say, okay, there is a cognitive dimension, let's say, to emotions.
Yeah.
And when they start talking about representation, so they literally talk about cognitive representations, right, of our individual evaluations of entities or events as being good or bad. So then you see how close you are, let's say, to the way, let's say, philosophers or whatever other experts, think about reason as a cognitive capacity. You see? And so again, getting back to Chomsky, it could very well be that he never mentioned feeling again, right, or emotion, simply because he said, well, it's part of what thought is. But again, so then we have to think about, and when sort of Chomsky refers to the conceptual intentional system, between brackets often, or other people say, okay, it's like our conceptual knowledge or planning, right, or our beliefs or intentions. Maybe you can add feelings, right, in the sense of emotive meaning or whatever, right, fine with me, I don't mind. Then in that case, you should maybe there are different thought systems. And maybe there are different sensory motor systems. Actually, in one of his writings, Chomsky hints at that. Maybe the system involved in perception is actually a different system from the system of articulation of sounds, the sensory motors. So that could be, but then at least you have to give contents, right, to these ideas.
Yeah. And then maybe looking at sort of future research direction. So when you sort of take what we've been discussing, right, and relate it to sort of the generative project, right, like what's missing from the picture, especially in like sort of the sense of emotion, right? Like what are some future research directions that you think are sort of critical?
To my knowledge, there are not many, or maybe even any. Well, presumably there are, but there are not many studies on the expression of emotion or affect in young children. And so the acquisition of the expression of emotion.
Yes.
Again, as a very general remark, you often hear, okay, young children, right? I mean, they don't think at a very sort of superficial and sort of, non-scientific level. Say, okay, those kids, right? I mean, they don't speak in meaningful ways. I mean, it all starts with interjections, just the utterance of sounds and whatever that are context related and not. But interestingly, I think the world is more complex than that. But by itself, it's an intriguing question, right? I mean, how do children learn or acquire the ways, right, of expressing their inner feelings linguistically? And in what way, I mean, if this approach in terms of secondary use of available means makes any sense, I mean, in what ways do children make use of that, right? Interestingly, as we know from, let's say, the study of, let's say, child linguistic expressions, right, that are non-emotive, we learn a lot from those linguistic expressions, because sometimes we see phenomena in child language that you don't find in the adult system, but which are properties available in human language. So, for example, there are properties in child language which you can find in Slavic languages. So, for example, which did you see book? We can't say it, but Dutch children can say it. So what you see is by studying children's language, you can discover properties that you don't immediately see when you study the adult language. So the interesting question could be, do children create linguistic expressions with affective properties which maybe are not in the adult system, but maybe do exist in the child system? So if sort of the interaction between the emotion system and language system is really there, then it would be interesting to look at a child language. And another dimension is, I think I mentioned it briefly, I don't know of my comparative linguistic research on the study of the encoding of, let's say, emotions in the structure of language. So what I did is I studied Dutch. That's my mother tongue. I have access to other native speakers and also to reference grammars about dialects, etc. But of course, you would also like to know to what extent similar phenomena are if attested in other languages.
Yeah,
and so, for example, take this very free expression of these Dutch curses. Often when I sort of discuss these with English native speakers, they say, "Oh, I don't have this, enormous freedom, let's say, of generating these expressions." And then it's okay, so what does it mean, right? Yeah. But when you look at languages, for example, an intriguing case was mentioned by a colleague of mine, Priti Patel. And she speaks the language Kuchi Gujarata or something, but it's a language spoken in India. And so there you saw interesting spreading of case properties, right, in emotional language, right? And that sort of connects to the spreading phenomenon I was discussing with indefinite articles, right? Or vowel harmony sort of spreading. So what you see is this procedure of spreading information throughout an expressive or an emotion load and construction is more widespread.
Yeah, right? Yeah, exactly.
But of course, we need to do more sort of careful research on that. Yeah.
But that's the question again for like uniformity and diversity, right? Like how that plays out. Yeah. But there's a real phenomena to be discussed, and there's a lot of work there to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. That's a good sort of, research agenda.
Yeah. And then maybe moving a little bit away, I guess, from sort of the interface of emotion and language, which, we've been discussing, obviously, sort of looking towards your future project, right? What you're going to be working on. So I know that you're going to be working on like how is manner encoded in the structural build of human language. So maybe you could just say a quick word about a new project, what that sort of focuses on.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, manner. Yeah, there is this new project about manner. Right. It's about the encoding of manner. John left the room quickly. Right. And sort of the idea is, okay, what are manner expressions like? What is their inner structure? Say, what are the differences between languages in the encoding of manner? So I tried to make sense of it. And so just for you and the audience, I mean, in English, of course, you have the famous element li, and John opened the box carefully. But in Dutch, for example, we don't have it. So we say John opened the box careful, right? Which actually in certain varieties of Dutch, you can also have. So sometimes you can. But let me try to make a connection with sort of the current topic about sort of emotion, because interestingly, even sort of in the expression of manner, there might be sort of a connection with the expression of emotion, because when you look at Dutch adverbs, even though we don't have, let's say, an equivalent of English li, as in carefully, I mean, interestingly, in Dutch, you can add a diminutive suffix to what looks like an adjective. And then the diminutive suffix is followed by je. I give you an example. Right? Because so Jan sprak zachtjes, and John spoke, with a soft voice, right? And so soft, and then a diminutive morpheme, right? Je, and then we have this S. And in a way, it's a funny construction, right? I don't know whether you agree with me, but normally the diminutive only follows nouns, as in huis, huisje. House, diminutive, meaning little house. But here, you have it right after what looks like an adjective. Furthermore, you have this funny property about this little S, the adverbial S. I wrote a paper about that. I won't discuss it. You can read it if you want. But again, diminutives, right, which are actually the opposites of what sometimes people call augmentatives, as in ik, ikke, the schwa, I plus schwa, is sort of, making things bigger. Right, but the diminutive is sort of making things smaller, and this has sort of a connection. In a way, it's connected to intensity, right? I mean, it's making something big or making something small. So here you see sort of an interesting use of diminutives that possibly, you have to investigate it very carefully, has a certain connection, right, to sort of the effective use of language, because we don't need to do it. I can also say, I opened the door zacht. Soft, or in a silent way, right? Without adding the diminutive. So you don't need the diminutive for expressing, let's say, the contents of the message. Then the intriguing question is, okay, why are you adding the diminutive? One other example is in manner expressions, we often use, let's say, simile expressions, like he walks like a duck, or he eats like a pig, which means in a pig-like way. Right? Or in a dog-like way. And sort of here, sometimes people say, okay, he behaves like a pig is sort of a negative evaluation. The syntax gives you the means to build sort of comparisons, simile expressions, right? And this is a way of sort of figurative language use, right? Which you can use to give evaluative judgments.
Yeah. I can see this. Yeah.
And so here you can see that the expression of positive or negative evaluation can also be expressed with simile expressions, which is intriguing.
No, that's very fascinating. So, Norbert, it's been a great conversation. Do you have any sort of parting words to the audience?
Yeah. So let me emphasize, I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yep,
and of course, we had other conversations like this, and I learned a lot from it. Well, sort of in the spirit of the title of your podcast, I thought, okay, well, dare to know, but dare to know things. That sort of was my experience. Dare to explore things that are outside of your, let's say, scientific comfort zone. And so I was on a campsite and I started reading the book by Damasio, Descartes' Error. I think it was even in France. So can you imagine reading a book in which Descartes is criticized in France? Anyway, but I learned a lot from it. And that's how I sort of got into the interaction between language and emotion. And so it's always a nice trigger to do sort of other things when you sort of read outside your own field. The other thing is, dare to take a comparative perspective, right? I think you'll always learn from comparing. I mean, that can be comparison of systems, what we talked about at the level of the architecture, let's say, of the human mind, but also sort of comparing languages, right? Yeah. So I started doing that. And it's really intriguing because sometimes by studying another language, you take a different perspective on your own language and you discover new things. As so, for example, I think in Mandarin Chinese, there are classifiers, right? Let's not go into it, but crucially, I think classifiers play an important role in the encoding of emotion in Dutch. And the other thing is, sort of dare to read old stuff. It sounds, and for you as a philosopher, this is a normal thing, right? Because of course you have to read Aristotle and Spinoza, your favorite Kant and whatever, right? But that's what I learned when you read sort of, the old, studies, for example. Well, take Cartesian linguistics. I don't think many sort of, young students read it, right? Even when you are in a linguistics education, right? And so you have to do it, all by yourself, but people should do it, right? And the same with Johann Gottfried Herder, or, I read Ernst Cassirer's book, whom we also know about, the book on symbols. Maybe you remember
Myth and Symbols, or is that another one? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I forgot exactly. But anyway, but that's sort of a very intriguing study where, interestingly, there is a chapter on the expression of emotion in language, where he goes back to the Cartesian period, right, and discusses. So that's him. So read also the older stuff, because, you can learn a lot from it. And the other thing is, and that's the final thing, but that holds in science, dare to be wrong. And so I started working on this. For me, this was completely sort of, terra incognita. I didn't know anything about emotions. And I'm sure, maybe emotion researchers laugh at me sort of when they hear me talk about this. At the same time, I have the feeling, that I at least encountered phenomena, linguistic phenomena that for me were new, for example, those curse expressions, and to which at least I could assign an analysis. Which means, we made a little progress, right? Presumably I'm wrong in the analysis of those expressions, but, hopefully and possibly we, made an extra step. So these are the dare to knows. And I would like to thank you with all my heart for this wonderful podcast series, because even though I know Chomsky's work a little bit, I learn a lot while listening to your podcast series. So that's great. So thank you for that.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I'm fully on board with the dare to knows that you've mentioned. So again, thanks.